and we're in chapter 48 of the Tanya. This edition from Kahot, if you're learning with us. And we're in the middle of a very, very profound section, which started way back in 41. So for anyone joining, and our tour of the emotions that we have in our soul at our disposal, and how to meditate and how to inspire them in our work in the world, started back in chapter 41. So let's go back and just look at the roadmap of where we've come from. So when we start, we'll be on the same page. Chapter 41, we learned that of the two emotions that we're working with in our souls to elevate all our learning and all of our mitzvahs, we have awe and we have love. And of those two, awe and love, one of them is foundational. One of them needs to come first in order for both to flow properly. And that foundational emotion is actually awe. Even though we learn in Beatles songs, love is all you need, you actually need awe first, or the love won't really flow. And you can watch those classes to recap that. Chapter 42, we learned about the capacity we each have to experience that awe and the love, and that is called da'at, it's called focus, because we decide what we focus on. And that focus comes to us through Moshe. Moshe is the shepherd of da'at, the shepherd of da'at and the shepherd of belief for all Jews. And we each have a little piece of Moshe inside of us that allows us to focus on that awe and that love and to inspire it. Chapter 43, we learned about... 42 was Moshe, was da'at. Chapter 43, we learned about the two types of love and the two types of awe. Because as we often say in Kabbalah, emotions are not kind of flowy, wishy-washy, where one overlaps with the other. They really are very distinct. And we, as meditators and as kabbalistic practitioners, want to have clear in our mind which emotion we are meditating to inspire and which one we are allowing to flow to elevate everything we do. So the two we learned about, Ahava Rabbah and Ahavat Olam, is a great love that's outside of the world, Ahava Rabbah, and Ahavat Olam, that's a love that connects to anything in the world or even the spiritual worlds. So those two, one is just relating to God's essence. The other, Ahavat Olam, the lower one, is relating to anything God does, including creating the highest heavens. And wow, I love God because I love heaven. I love chocolate cake too here on earth, so I love God. All of it. And then also two levels of yira. Two levels of awe. Yira ila'ah, the higher level of awe, and yira tata, the lower level of awe. None of which, by the way, is fear of punishment. So we made that point when we learned chapter 43. Fear of punishment is not something that we consider part of the divine soul. Fear of punishment is a self-centered activity, part of the animal soul, and it really has no place in this practice. However, I should have respect and awe for something greater than me, something so much more intelligent and loving than me, and that's the awe we're talking about, almost at the highest level, just a shame of even being in front of someone that great, and I'm almost nullified. I'm not there, I'm gone, right? But in no way has this anything to do with fear of punishment. Chapter 44, we learned about two types of love. These are hybrid loves, if you recall. And so they relied on both the higher and the lower aspects of love. Thanks, Rick. I appreciate it. Now we're all with the text. Good. One was my soul desires you at night, where we rely on the natural attachment we have to life and our life force. And we recognize that comes from God, and so we love God like we love our life. And the second one was the love of a child to a parent. Even more than my life, even more than I love my life, I love my parents. I would give my life up for them. And so when I recognize that the source of all is really all of our parent, that's where we stem from, now we trigger that love and we love beyond even what we love for our life. They're hybrid because this is a knee-jerk reaction. Everyone loves their life, etc. And yet it takes a little meditation on our part for us to just uncover that and allow that love to flow. That was 44. 45, we learned about another pathway to trigger love again, and that is through the gateway of compassion. We said, if I think about my soul and all the things I've done, I have compassion for that spark of God in my soul, which is having to deal with all of my bad choices and all my narishkeit. And that spark of God, that's actually God. God is going through all that with me. And when I feel compassion on that spark of my soul, that's compassion for God, and God reflects compassion to me, and that will allow love to flow. It was a very powerful meditation if you review it. And then we got to the section we're in now, which is a 4-chapter section, 46 through 47, 48, 49. It really is 2 pairs. 46 and 47 went together. We learned about the phenomenon, kamayim hapanim al panim. The same way a face is reflected in water, or in this case, in our Zoom squares and on Facebook, right? If my face is smiling on the Facebook screen, it means my face is smiling here, right? There's no delay, there's no separation. I don't have to wonder. Clearly, if I'm smiling there, I'm smiling here. The same thing happens between 2 hearts. If one heart shows love to someone else, that second heart will reflect love back automatically. And as we said, it may be outside of consciousness. We may, with free will, decide not to express that love. It may be covered up by toxicity, whatever it may be. But somewhere in our heart, even if we're not aware, when someone expresses love to me, it reflects back automatically. And we got a whole mashal, a whole example of a king that finds a peasant in a dung heap and pulls them out and brings them to the palace and embraces them. And how would that common person living on a trash heap feel overflowing love, where their heart would melt for this ruler, this great person that took them into their most private chambers? And then we saw how that applies to us. The people Israel were in Egypt, were taken out directly by the source of the universe and brought to Sinai to be given God's greatest desires, God's innermost intellect in the form of the Torah, and it was like a wedding. We had the unity of a married couple. And if that doesn't, I feel a reflection of love right now, just describing it in brief. Imagine sitting, as we do, for 5, 10, 15 minutes at the beginning of the day or during your prayer, and meditating on that and allowing that reflected love to flow into your prayers and into this learning. Clearly, we'd be raising up parts of the world that otherwise might stay around here. And finally, 47, we attacked the question, okay, maybe I get reflected love thinking about this Exodus story from 3,000 years ago, but it was 3,000 years ago. It was my great ancestors. How do I relate to that personally every day? And so in our last chapter, we learned, the Alter Rebbe stressed, we're supposed to consider ourselves as if we'd come out of Egypt, but there's an opinion in the Talmud we should consider as if we come out of Egypt today, every day, each day. And although that's not the tradition that made it into the Haggadah, it's there, it's an opinion. The Alter Rebbe says that's what's happening spiritually, because Kabbalistically, when we say the Shema, we're actually being taken out of Egypt. When we say the Shema, our soul, maybe at a level above consciousness, but we can connect with that. Our soul experiences a unity with the Ein Sof that takes us completely out of our personal restrictions, and that's what Egypt means. It means restrictions. So that should be, the Shema every day should be our chance, your chance and my chance, to leave our personal restrictions that day, and then, of course, to have that reflected love of saying, wow, God just took me out of Egypt. God just allowed me to leave my finite restrictions and let that love reflect back as I'm praying. And this is the first piece of what we discussed, that we're going through the heart of how you pray from a Kabbalistic perspective here. And we're going to get more tools about the blessings of the Shema as we go on. Now you're all very caught up. I'm sure we all followed that very, very clearly. So,
It's so clear.
yeah, I don't want to go back and pick apart each of the topics, but any questions on the overall shape before we dive into chapter 48? Or can somebody be on Facebook watch and let me know if there's any comments on Facebook? My phone is in my bag.
Sure, I just want to say, it is in the Haggadah. Because when we say Mani Kana Halal Hazeh, when we say this night,
Yeah.
that's what it means, today. And all the days. And it's the same.
Okay, so we have a
This
comment
night is
here.
not
Yeah.
just the night in Egypt way back when, it's for now.
So this is a different angle. So the question is, I'm opening up Facebook here to check for questions while we're doing this. Just be 1 second. There we are. We're live. I'm quiet. Comments. I have comments open, so let me know. Comments here, folks. The comment was, when we say the Mani Shana, we say, why is this night different than all other nights? And that you feel is connecting the Seder night to every night? That's the understanding?
The Seder night to the night in Egypt. Yeah, I mean, it renews itself every year. It's the
Annually, yeah, it renews
Yeah.
itself every year. But the Mani Shana, the 4 questions are saying, why is this night different than all other nights?
It's-
Right? Not the same, but different. So tonight I remember the Exodus by telling the story, etc., etc. But does that mean all other nights I do? I don't know, because it's saying why is it different? So it's not clear to me.
It's this night. That's the point. It's
On Passover, it's this
on
night.
Passover.
But this morning, was it this morning? Based on the 4 questions. That's the question.
I don't know about that. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But I'm
that's
just saying the recollection of being there.
yeah.
You're there today, and that's what makes you there today, because you're saying this night.
Yeah. I of course it's connected. I agree.
Yeah.
But the idea, and we went through in the last chapter, the idea that we are commanded to remember the Exodus every day. We're only commanded to remember that we came out of Egypt 3,000 years ago today, and we should consider ourselves as if we had come out of Egypt, but not necessarily as if we'd come out of Egypt this morning, right? That's the extra piece. I don't think that anywhere in the Haggadah it says every day you should remember that you came out of Egypt that very day. That's something the Alter Rebbe added, which he drew from the Talmud. It was a source. It wasn't his idea, but he focused on it, which the Haggadah is really about remembering that we came out of Egypt, period, not this morning. Whereas the point we made was, why is the piece about Exodus attached to Vehavta, attached to the Shema? Because we actually are commanded to remember it every day, so it's attached, but also because that's what just happened in the Shema. When I said the Shema, I did come out of Egypt. I'm not remembering that I came out of Egypt historically. I'm remembering that I came out of Egypt 5 minutes ago in the Shema, and now I'm somewhere else. I'm united with God. It gives me a different love for God. It's a big piece, but that was the last chapter we just did. Any other, hi Eleanor, any other thoughts or questions? I love watching, by the way, the readout on Facebook. When you say Shechina, what does it give you? Right? Look at this. Oh, it takes, there's a delay. Right? And when you say Chasidus, what does it give you? Have you tried this?
No.
When you say Klipa, what does it give you? I'm always worried about let's take a tour through gonna say Tzimtzum and see what it gives us. Okay, here we go. Here it's coming. Let's take a tour through, going to say Simsum. That was not bad. All right. It's looping around now. Well, that wasn't very fun. I thought that'd be funny. Maybe I'll edit that out of the YouTube when we post it. All right, chapter 48. Ready? And let's start it in our Temple Israel Tanya. I got a copy right here. Perek Memchet. This is the Moach. This is the brains of the Tanya. So Lamed Bet Lev was 32. That's the heart of the Tanya. How to love another Jew like yourself. This is Moach Memchet, the brains of the Tanya. And we're going to prepare ourselves for the next chapter where we come back to reflected love, but we're going to learn about how can the world exist, because it's finite, when there's an infinite God. It should be impossible. So how's that working? What's happening with this crazy light? V'hine kasheit bonen hamaskil b'gdulat ein sof baruch hu. Ki kishmo ken hu ein sof ve'ein ketz v'tachlit klal la'or v'chayut hamitpashet mimenu. Am I done? Hold on. Yitbarech b'rtzono hapashut. Cindy, you with us? Yeah.
Yep.
So you'll want to unmute, and I'll mute. Just read loud then. This mic will get you.
Good enough. Contemplating the greatness of the blessed Ein Sof, the thinking person will come to the realization that as his name indicates, so is he. There is no end or limit or finitude at all to the light and vitality that diffuse from his simple will. Simple in the sense that it has no cause, nor is it subject to the limitations inherent in mortal will.
It's a technical check. Eleanor, can you hear Cindy reading through this microphone here? It's clear enough? And am I too loud? It's good, good. So here we go. If we contemplate, and that means meditate, right? This is meditation, on the greatness of the Ein Sof, of the infinite, the person who is meditating will come to realize that there's no end or limit to the light and vitality that diffuses from God's will. So we often talk about Or Ein Sof, the light of the Ein Sof, and we've described it, it's not the Ein Sof itself. There's God, the Ein Sof, very, very simply, right? I'm going to contradict that in a second. And then there's the Or of the Ein Sof, which is the light that comes off of God. It's not physical light, as we've said many times. Anyone joining us, light is just a metaphor for whatever that life force is, that indescribable flow and power that is not even spiritual, but then becomes spiritual, becomes physical, all that. We call it light for a lot of reasons. But we consider the Or Ein Sof to be just the light that comes from the Ein Sof, not the Ein Sof itself. And here the Alter Rebbe says, actually, even though it's just called Or Ein Sof, the light of the Ein Sof, it's not something separate from the Ein Sof, where there's infinity and then infinity has something flowing from it, that's its light. The light of the Ein Sof is also Ein Sof itself. It is infinity itself. And by the way, Ein Sof is not God's essence either, because Ein Sof is also a definition, right? Not to go down this rabbit hole, but Ein Sof means without end. There's also an even higher quality, which is Ein without a beginning. Oi, the word not Tachlis. Tachlis is coming, which is not Ein Tchila, right? Something without a beginning. And in Kabbalah, it's discussed, I'm sure there's other opinions, that something that is without beginning is actually higher than something without end. But without end, Ein Sof is still just a description, and so is without beginning. All of that, in fact, God's essence is beyond any of it. So it depends on where you're talking about. If we're talking about the physical world, fine. Ein Sof is God, and the Or Ein Sof is something that comes from God. But actually, the Or Ein Sof is also infinite, and Ein Sof is not actually God, and God's essence is indefinable. So it's a little like that. But for the purposes of our conversation, we want to recognize the Or Ein Sof is actually infinite. It's not finite. And the question arises, how is it possible for something finite to come out of something infinite? Because no matter how much you try to downgrade infinity and try to chunk down infinity, if you have any relation to infinity, you're never going to get to finity. So, finity, something with any dimensions whatsoever, be they physical or spiritual or temporal, anything with any possible measurable dimensions or definitions, should not be able to come out of something that is truly infinite. Should be impossible. So we're going to go into that question. Who's next?
And which is united with his essence and being in perfect unity.
So that light is actually infinity. It is actually united with God's essence in perfect unity. And you shouldn't be able to process it in any way and get something finite out of it, because it's just infinite. Or to put it another way, if it's truly infinite and something else exists that is finite, that is distinct, now there's something missing from infinity. Infinity should not allow for anything finite to exist. It should not be able to flow out of it by definition. So we have a sort of a physics problem here. ואילו הייתה השתלשלות העולמות מאור אין סוף ברוך הוא בלי צמצומים רק כסדר המדרגות ממדרגה למדרגה בדרך עילה ועלול. Paula, if you'd like to read, if you unmute.
I was next.
Pardon me, Nora.
I'm next.
But you want to unmute your phone? We'll get you here.
Got it?
Yeah.
Unmute me, because I unmuted.
No, you just have to read loud.
Did you unmute me?
Cantor, did you unmute me?
You're good. If you read now, you're good.
And the worlds descended from the light of the blessed Ein Sof without contractions, but according to a gradual descent from grade to grade by means of cause and effect, the loftier level being the direct cause for the manifestation of the level immediately following it. What?
So What? Yes, you see how this is the moach, right? So we're getting a little complex. If the worlds had descended from the light of the Ein Sof, so the world is being created by God, so descended from that light, without contractions. Contractions means concealing, stopping, shrinking, holding back the infinite light. But if it had been done according to any kind of cause and effect, then the Alter will say, anything created would have to have some point of reference to what created it, and it cannot have become finite. Because if you have cause and effect, right? If it's really just a bunch of dominoes, and I have a massive domino the size of the solar system, and I tip that over and it knocks over a smaller domino the size of a planet, it knocks over the smaller domino the size of a satellite, and so on, until you get to this book or this cell phone. And feel free to ask questions if you're watching online. Welcome, people. If it was that, each one of those dominoes may be smaller than the one before it, but it has some relation. It has some. If there's a cause and effect, if something is causing something else, then they're in some way connected. There was some point, whether it was spiritual, whether it was temporal, whether it was physical, whether it was energetic, whatever you want to call it. Cause and effect, there's always some point of comparison between the cause and the effect. Otherwise, the cause could not be affecting the effect. If they are so completely separate and apart from each other, they have nothing to do with each other, there's no way that cause could be affecting that effect, because they have no relation to each other. Right? Something that is, let's not go deep on that. That'll go crazy. But it's called Ilu v'Alul, cause and effect. And that is one way that the world is created. There is a chain of cause and effect within each world, right? The clouds come and the rain falls and it fills up the lake. And same thing spiritually. Within the spiritual world of Asiya, there are causes which create effects, and they're related to each other. But for any of those worlds to come out of the Ein Sof itself, that couldn't have happened through cause and effect. If it had, the worlds would still be infinite. Because infinity is, if it's related to anything else, can only create infinity. I'm getting ahead. What could you divide infinity by to get anything finite? Let's do it mathematically, yeah.
This is so over my head right now. I'm having a hard time grasping the whole concept.
Okay, just over. It's over everybody's head. It's over my head,
Okay.
right? So we're talking about things that's over our heads by definition, right? But in numbers, if I have infinity, I can divide it by any real number as big as I want. I'm never going to leave infinity, right? Infinity divided by 100 or a billion or a trillion is still infinity. Infinity is equally distant from 100, a billion, or trillion, or any number, right? I'll skip ahead. Here's a more physical way to look at it, okay? Say I build, and this is, by the way, from Tully Silverberg. I don't know if you got it from someone else, but Yeshikoach, I watched your class on this. Say I build a perfectly round racetrack for running, with the springy turf and stuff. And no lines, no start and finish, just a nice round racetrack, simple like that. Now 2 people come to this racetrack. One of them runs around it 2 or 3 times. One of them runs around it 40 or 50 times. Which one of them got closer to the end of the racetrack? Right, you're just shaking your head. That doesn't even relate. I mean, there's no beginning and no end in a circle. They're running around the circle. There's no end. There's no way to get to the end. And you could run around it a billion times, and that has no bearing on the question, are you closer to the end of the racetrack? It's a different phenomenon. And there's no possible way any times running around that track is going to affect whether you got to the end of that track. The end of that track, that's infinity. It's a different phenomenon, right? The world, okay, there's lofty spiritual worlds that maybe, they're whizzing around that track at the speed of light. I don't care. They're just going around the track. There's no end to it. So there's no way for infinity, which is the end of the track, it's not even there, to somehow relate to how many times we're going around this track. And that's the Hishtashlut. That's the creation of the worlds.
So is that saying that when God created the world is still a part of God?
The world is still a part of God, so that's also true.
It's not separate.
Correct. The world is not separate, but
it's not
but the world is finite, right? So that's the problem. it's true. The world is God. The world is, it's all
Is
God.
the world really finite though? I thought you said it's always being created.
I mean, it's measurable, right? This room has dimensions, and the day has a length of time.
But it has no end.
From our perspective, but from God's perspective.
Yeah, from God's perspective, it's not there. From God's perspective, it's not finite because it doesn't exist,
Right.
right? So that's a contradiction that never ends, right? So, but we want to focus on how could a seemingly finite world come out of an infinite light? That's the question here, and we're looking at the dynamics of it. And we're going to look at two types of light that will give us a tool to kind of like bridge this. Yes, Cindy?
So my question is, yes, things here are finite, but what about souls? Since souls are created, everything's created by God, but souls are like linked to God. Are souls then infinite?
Depends what you compare them to, right? But in this conversation, when I say the divine soul is an actual piece of God, and so compared to my physical body, you could say the soul is infinite. But in this conversation, we're talking about absolute infinity, God's essence. The soul is also finite compared to that.
Okay.
Yeah, so it always depends what you're talking about. I'm sure that's contradicted in 1,000 places in Hasidus, what I just said, but it's also supported.
The reading is not coming through clear. You're going to have them use the device.
Okay, I'll mute and you guys turn your phones on. Thank you, Eleanor. That's good to know. We're on top of 7:30. Lo haya holam hazeh nivra klal kmo shehu ata bivchinat gvul v'tachlit me'haaretz l'rakia mahalach taf kuf shana. So now we're going to Paula. Paula, if you want to unmute yourself, I'll mute me on my end. Sue Ellen, why don't you unmute and go ahead?
This world and all it contains would not have been created in its present form, in infinite and limited order. From the earth to the firmament is a distance of 500 years, 500 years journey being a finite dimension.
So the world and all it contains could have been created as it is. And here we get some of the cosmology, the astronomy of the Alter Rebbe's time. They understood the universe as having sort of spheres, and those spheres were layered layer upon layer, and they were all moving. That was the scientific understanding of the world. And the description is the distance from the earth to the first one of those heavens is a 500 years journey. A 500 years journey. So if I were to walk, you got a day's walk and you got a week's walk. If I were to walk for 500 years, 5 centuries, that's the distance that they projected to the first one of those firmaments, those heavenly spheres. And you know, our astronomy is obviously much more technical now, so it might sound a little funny, but interesting that we still measure distance by time. We still talk about light years, the amount of time it takes for light to travel in a year, the amount of distance the light will travel in a year. Thank you. And here he's also talking about distance in terms of time, the amount of time it takes for us to walk for 500 years. But whatever it might be, whether using today's wonderful telescopes or the astronomy of his time, it still is finite. A billion light years is still measurable, just like a 500 years journey is still measurable. So it doesn't really matter what the distances are projected. We know that everything in the universe is actually measurable and finite in terms of distance, energy, time, etc. And so whatever it is, there is a certain amount of distance to any property or any phenomenon in the universe. That makes it measurable and finite. How is it happening? From an infinite light. V'chein ben kol rakia l'rakia v'chein o vi kol rakia l'verakia. Linda, if you go ahead.
And similarly, limited is the distance between one firmament and the next. And so also the radial extent of each firmament is a distance of 500 years, and all the above applies to this world.
Beautiful. And so it goes on. There's many spheres layered upon each other in the astronomy, the scientific astronomy of that time. And each one was 500 years walk thick and then there was 500 years between that and the next one, and so there's distances. But whether you're talking about modern astronomy, or whether you're talking about older astronomy, or whether you're talking about our spiritual understanding of the spiritual worlds, even the very highest heavens, the higher Gan Eden, right? Like the world of Bria, with all the tzaddikim that are there and the greatest angels that are there, even that world, which is spiritual and not physical, still has some kind of spiritual dimension and still is not absolutely infinite, and still could not have been created from something truly infinite. So we have a problem going all the way up to the highest worlds. The answer is tzimtzum. Tzimtzum. So many of us have heard that word. It means contraction, restriction, holding back. God used something called tzimtzum to affect the Or Ein Sof, that infinite light, so that something could come out on the other side that was somehow no longer infinite. And there's a whole, you could study for years the types of tzimtzum and how it happens. We're not going to go into that in this chapter because that's not the point of this chapter. But once we have tzimtzum, now we have a quality of light that can relate to something finite, and a quality of light that cannot relate to something finite. And we're going to use those two qualities of light to see how this trick is happening of a finite world. As he says, "V'afilu olam haba v'gan eden ve'ha'elyon midor nishmot nishmot hatzadikim hagdolim v'hanashamot atzman ve'ein sarich lomar hamlachim hen b'fchinat gvul v'tachlit." Rick, go ahead.
To there, loud?
Oh, use your phone. I'll mute. Just go loud.
Even the world to come and the higher level of Gan Eden, the abode of the souls of the great tzaddikim, and the souls themselves, and needless to add, the angels, are all in the realm of bounds and limitation.
So everything. It's not just the Milky Way, but also the spiritual heavens, the world to come, the higher and lower Gan Eden, all of this. This is not God. This is just the spiritual worlds. These are still worlds, even though they seem infinitely above us. They're still all in the realm of bounds and limitation. They have some definition.
So is that the answer to Cindy's question?
I forgot Cindy's question.
Your soul's infinite.
Right.
Soul's infinite.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll say yes. Yes, that is the answer. כי יש גבול להשגתן באור אין סוף ברוך הוא המאיר עליהן בהתלבשות חוכמה בינה דעת כולו. Doreen, do you want to?
For there is a limit to their apprehension of the light of the blessed Ansaf, which shines upon them, though being clothed in Chabad, and so on.
Excellent. I love how you read. Such a great voice. There's a limit to how much they can apprehend, how much we hear about souls in Gan Eden, and they're sitting basking in the light of the Ein Sof, that it was created by the mitzvahs and the Torah they learned, and they see the full beauty of it, and they're appreciating it and getting pleasure. But there's a limit. They can only apprehend the light of the Ein Sof, not the Ein Sof itself. They can only apprehend the Torah that they absorbed when they were here, not the Torah of somebody else. That's why they say they have various palaces and places in Gan Eden. And I might learn some Torah, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to go to Gan Eden and I'm going to bask in the light of Nachman of Bratslev's Torah, right? Some genius. They have their own abode, their place, and the Torah that they learned was at a different level. They get that light. I get my light that I learned. So each one of us still has a limit. Even if you're a tzaddik in the higher Gan Eden, there's still a limit to what you can apprehend, which shines on them by being clothed in their intellect. Hence, v'lachen yesh gvul lahanatan, shenehenin miziv hashchina umitangin beor Hashem. Dan, why don't you're on, just go nice and loud.
Hence, there is also a limit to the enjoyment that they derive from the rays of the Shekinah and to their pleasure in the light of God.
So there's a limit to how much they can absorb into their intellect, and so there's a limit to how much enjoyment they can derive from the rays of the Shekhinah, the rays of the infinite.
How does Moses fit into all this?
Moses is the greatest prophet. Moses is, I'm sure...
He was able to be with God. He was able to...
Right, but we learned he didn't see God's panim, God's essence. He just saw God's back, God's acharayim. And the Arizal talks about the level at which Moses was able to see. It was only up to the netzach and hod of either Bria or Yitzira, I forget what he said, right? So in terms of prophecy, Moses was only able to see up to a certain point, greater than any other prophet. Moses was able to connect with God directly, just like that. But even for Moses, Moses is still a limited created being, the greatest prophet, right? The greatest tzaddik. But it's still measured and limited, right? Not, you could see God's back and not God's front. That's a measure, that's a limit. Why? Ki ein yicholin lekabel hanaa v'tanug bivchinat ein sof mamash shelo yitbatlu mimtziutan v'yachzeru limkoran. And did everybody read? Is anybody left? Let's start over. Cindy, go ahead.
For they are incapable of deriving enjoyment and delight of an infinite order without being nullified out of their existence and returning to their source.
All right, so in the end, if I were to actually recognize God's perspective, the perspective of God's essence, the pleasure from God's absolute perspective of what's going on here, the world doesn't exist to God. And so if I were to relate to that, now I couldn't be there. I'd be nullified out of existence.
So you're like the ray of the sun. You're not separate, you just kind of get absorbed back in.
You're like,
and you don't exist.
to use that example, you're like the ray of the sun before it leaves the sun, while it's still in the ball of the sun. So this is something that we went to deeply in Shar Yichud V'Emunah, which talks about exactly this, how a finite world can be created and how it all works. And the Alter Rebbe says, imagine a ray of the sun, but before it's left the sun, while it's still in the sphere of the sun, does it even exist? So there's no light, there's no ray of a sun inside the sun. It's crazy energy, and I don't know what kind of fusion's going on in there. Same thing here. If I were to actually appreciate fully God's perspective, I'm just a ray of the sun inside the sun. I have no existence whatsoever. I'd have to be nullified. Even in the state where I'm a soul in heaven, I still cannot fully appreciate how I'm just a ray of the sun in the sun and have no existence. I only get my measured limit of what I can appreciate. It's what you're saying, I think, yeah? Yeah. Now, v'hineh, so who's next? Eleanor will go with you. V'hineh pratiyut hatzimtzumim echuma ein kan mekom be'uram.
Is it for they are incapable? Is that where we are?
Now as for.
Okay, here we go. Now, as for the intricate details of the contractions, how they achieve their effect and what they actually are, this is not the place for their explanation.
That's some Alter Rebbe comedy right there. So we got some giggles because we're trying to explain it. But it's true. The point of this book, we didn't come to the Tanya to understand the cosmos and the divine light and how the worlds are created. That there's other Kabbalah for that, there's other Hasidus for that. It's all out there if you want to learn it. But we came here, right? We came here because it's very close in your mouth and in your heart to do it. Right? So the point of this is just to work as being a soul in a body, being a Bainani, and getting thought, speech, and action right, and elevating the world. This is a textbook on how to do that. It's a process. It's a technique. So really, you don't need to understand the intricacies of Tzimtzum. Goodness, like that. You don't need to understand the intricacies of Tzimtzum in order to understand this technique and put it into practice. So he's not going to go deep into that. There's other places in other sections of the Tanya, like the letters, etc., where he does actually go in some depth into that stuff, and it's great. There's still one letter that, everybody that I know is like, you just read that letter, you can't understand it. It's just, the thing just keeps going up and up and up with all these, ideas and kabbalistic sources, and you just, But here, what are we for? We want to learn just how to apply this. So, the different types of tzimtzumim that are described in other places, sometimes there's one like a curtain, which means you got a light here and the curtain just blacks it out completely and there's nothing on the other side. There's one that's described as like a hair, which means imagine all the activity in life in my brain. Now compare that to the activity in life in one of my hairs that's still remaining on my little kepi, right? So the amount of life in one hair, imagine you got a hairbrush and you pull one hair out of it, all that hair. How does that compare to the life and force and vitality that was in the brain that it came from? That's another form of contraction, if you can imagine. The light before is like the brain, and the light after is just like one hair that grew out of the head that contained that brain. And there's many more. It's a whole detailed study. So we're going to skip over that and know the point is just the general idea that infinite light was somehow blocked and changed so you could have something else. Yes, Dan?
I'm just in bad shape.
I'm sorry. Okay. I thought there was a comment coming.
It was perfectly clear.
It's like, when you have a baby and you're like holding a baby, like, oh, the baby's smiling at me, and the mom's like, no, that's indigestion. I think these chapters are like that. We look at each other, we're all like, we have an expression, but it's.
He's talking about hair. I'm saying I'm in bad shape.
Oh, the hair. Sorry, I didn't catch that. I'm baldness blind. I don't even see it anymore. I blocked it out of for obvious reasons. Derech klal הם בחינת הסתר והלם המשכת האור והחיות. Yeah.
But in general, there's something in the nature of an obscuring and concealment of the flow of light and vitality.
So just in general, we don't want to go into the details, but in general, somehow the light and vitality is able to be concealed so that this Or Ein Sof is now creating measurable, finite, spiritual and physical world. שלא יהיה ויומשך לתחתונים בבחינת גילוי להתלבש ולהשפיע בהן ולהחייתם להיות יש מאין. We're at Paula, would you like to read? Oh, you're not? Yeah, it's fine. Linda, go ahead.
So that the light and vitality should illumine and reach the lower creatures in a revealed manner, pervading them and acting in them and animating them in such a way that they exist ex nihilo.
Linda, let's do one more.
In only an extremely minute measure so that they be in a state of finitude and limitation.
Good. So that light should come and be able to reach lower creatures in a way that something can be revealed to them without them being nullified, as we said. Something can pervade them and act in them and animate them so that they exist out of nothing. Because really, we said, from God's perspective, the world's not here. It's all coming out of nothing, being created by God's power. But only in a minute measure so that they can actually have this state of finitude and limitations. And in the few minutes we have left, let me just introduce the two forms of divine flow that we're going to learn about, and then we'll do a little quick meditation to end. And that is, there's two types of divine light that flow into the world. One is a divine light that actually relates to the world. A divine light that relates to the world, or mimale. And that's a light that is actually enclosed in the world. So everything, even quantum physics says, I look at this mouse, and really it's empty space with energy in it. It's almost all empty space, and the energy presents itself to me as a physical object. But what my senses see, the physical object, that's not really the best map of reality. That's just our evolutionary shortcut for dealing with phenomena, right? So my mind is mapping out a physical object. The fact that my finger stops when it hits it, it's not what I think it is, right? It's just empty space with energy. And that energy is presenting a world to me. So same thing here. There's a spiritual energy that is constantly flowing into and relating to every phenomenon in the universe, including this mouse, including this planet, including the whole cosmos, including every living being. And that energy relates to and is tailored to that phenomenon. So that is called or mamale, or the filling light, the light that relates to, the light that actually goes into the world like you would put on a piece of clothing, and now the light is in the thing. There's another one called or sovev, which is a surrounding light, which is a light that is still in an infinite state and cannot relate in any way to anything finite, and it cannot relate to the world, and it's not enclosed in the world. But as I introduce it, keep in mind, and we'll learn, when we say surrounding, we don't mean surrounding physically so that it's not there. The surrounding light actually is here too. The surrounding light is everywhere, obviously, in time, space, consciousness, whatever you want. It's just that it has, the things that are created have no capacity to relate to or express that light. Right? There's all kinds of 5G radio signals flowing around this room, but this wonderful backpack, it's flowing through them, just like it's flowing through this phone, but this backpack cannot relate to that 5G radio signal. It cannot express it. It cannot relate to it. It doesn't, you don't know it's there, right? It doesn't absorb it in any way, even if it's flowing through just like in this phone. This phone is a different vessel, a different keli, and this phone is designed to relate to that 5G that's still everywhere. So the 5G, compared to the backpack, you'd say it's surrounding, it's mamala, even though it's right in the backpack. Compared to the phone, sovev to the backpack, mamala, flowing into the phone, because the phone relates to it and expresses it. So now imagine a whole universe. Anything that can happen, any phenomenon, there's a light that phenomenon is receiving, and the light relates to that thing. But there's another light that cannot relate to creation anyway, even though we're all here in that light. It's all within us, but it's not discernible. Right? The effect of mamala is discernible. The effect of sovev is not discernible. I hope that simplified everything. We'll get into that next week. Let's do a quick meditation. See why this is called the moach of the Tanya. It's the brains of the Tanya.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Eleanor.
Using your analogy, like the backpack and the phone and the 5G, would we say that the tzaddik could get in touch with the light of God, like the phone gets in touch with the 5G?
So not just the tzaddik, but us also. So you know, the tool is Torah mitzvahs, because as we said, a mitzvah is completely transparent to God's light, and a mitzvah can shortcut this and can bring that surrounding light into the world in a revealed way. That's the mind-blowing beauty of a mitzvah and Torah study too. So even though it shouldn't, in our tradition, we can express that surrounding light through Torah mitzvahs, but that's not of our own quality. That's because Torah mitzvahs are also united with God and can connect to that essence in a way that we can't. So not just a tzaddik, you and I, we can do it right now. Let's just a 2-minute touch on our meditation. Let's find ourselves in a relaxed, calm state, nice long spine, shoulders falling. If you need to sign off or leave, no worries. Let's just deepen our breathing. So if you're looking for a good place to explore what filling light is, just look into your breath. That's the first appearance of the soul in consciousness, perhaps, or in the physical realm, maybe better. Where is it coming from? What's that life force within it? That's very, very related to this filling light. So let your breath smooth. I'm not going to guide you through the counts. Let's just do your own meditative practice today. Even out your breathing. Let's insert into our consciousness, into that clear mind. Kamaim apanim, as a face is reflected in water, that our heart is reflecting God's love. God took each of us out of our own limitations when we said the Shema this morning. Just see what emotions arise as we recognize God's personal love towards each of us, and coming and pulling us out of our limitations and uniting us with God's very essence. these emotions that we will bring into all the choices, all the productive things we'll do today. So any sense of love, any sense of awe that you feel, just put a little anchor in that, put a little pin in that. And when a moment comes, either a challenging moment or a critical conversation or a surprising interaction, just take the same breath in you're taking now and come back to this place. Let those emotions flow into that situation. And make sure you're at your highest self with the opportunity God is presenting you. So we'll wiggle our toes and our fingers, open our eyes. Thanks, everyone. This is a great way for me to start the day, and God willing, I'll be my highest self for everything that comes across my plate, and so will you. If you'd like to join us, please email Maya at temple-israel.org. We'll send you all the links so you can be here in person, on the Zoom, and Facebook. Thanks, Judy, for watching, and we'll see you all next time.